Okay, guys, welcome back. Um, this is just some more research into how Christianity got into Britain, and I came across an interesting story of Joseph of Arimathea. I was looking into the Glastonbury myth, and it's quite interesting actually. Like, apparently, Joseph of Arimathea was a, a trader in Britain. He used to trade in tin, and he apparently brought Jesus over here when he was a teenager. But there's different kinds of tales. Um, but when I've been looking into this, Christianity seemed to have been in Britain well before countries closer to us, like Denmark and um, the Scandinavian countries, um, even the Romans. Even the Romans, when the Romans came over, they were pagan. I think they found Christianity was thriving in Britain. And there's a few reasons why I think this has happened. One of them is that Christianity was a homegrown religion from Britain, and it was discovered by the Romans and taken back and changed, or it was brought here by tribes. These tribes could be, I think, could be connected to the Gaels, the Gaelic speaking people. I think they could have brought it with them. I'm still sort of investigating that. And the third could be this. This could be a third reason how Christianity got into Britain. But anyway, guys, I'll read you the article. It's quite a long one. But it's interesting. So if you just bear with me and listen in, it's quite good. Right, this is done by Beyond Today, an article, but there's lots of articles about this story. This is another one, but it's not as detailed. This one starts with early Welsh genealogy shows that most of the early British monarchies claimed descent in one way or another from Beli Moa the Great, who can be identified with the Celtic god Belenos. However, in his mortal form, Beli was said to have been husband of Anna, the daughter of Saint Joseph of Arimathea. At first, this claim might seem quite extraordinary. Saint Joseph was the man who had taken Christ's body down from the cross and given up his own tomb for Christ's last resting place. So, and this is the some of the lyrics in this New Jerusalem song, I think it was called. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? Talking about Jesus. Anyway, Appendix 11, Joseph of Arimathea in the line of Nathan. The Davidic line of kings that ruled over the ancient nation of Judah came through David's son Solomon at the time of Judah's fall to the Babylonians in 586 BC. This lineage, as explained in this publication, was continued by transferal of the monarchy to Ireland. The Solomonic monarchy was later moved to Scotland around AD 500 and, later still, transplanted into England when King James of Scotland became King of all Great Britain. Thus, the current British sovereign, Queen Elizabeth II, is a direct descendant of David through Solomon, but she may be descended from another son of David as well. This possibility revolves around certain people who lived at the time of Jesus, chief of whom is a man referred to in the New Testament as Joseph of Arimathea, who is identified with Britain in medieval tradition. As we will see, it is a rather fascinating story. The immediate family of Jesus. King David had a number of children. Great honour, of course, went to Solomon, who was blessed with riches in the aforementioned dynasty. Yet the greatest honour actually went to David's son Nathan, for from him descended Jesus Christ. Matthew 1 contains the genealogy of Jesus' adoptive father Joseph, son of Jacob, from Solomon. Luke 3, which lists the genealogy from Nathan, might also seem to be the family record of Joseph, but he is here listed as being the son of Heli. Verse 23. Actually, the literal Greek says only Joseph of Heli, not son of Heli. Now the genitive of does not imply son of throughout the remainder of the genealogy. But in this case, it is widely acknowledged to mean son-in-law of, making Heli the father of Joseph's wife Mary, who truly was the mother of Jesus. Yet Jesus and Mary were not the only ones mentioned in the New Testament who shared this royal lineage from Nathan. Mary had other children besides Jesus. The people of Nazareth asked regarding Jesus, "Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, and his sisters, are they not all with us?" Matthew 13:55-56. Indeed, these brothers and sisters were also of the line of Solomon, being children Mary had with Joseph. We also see mention of Jesus' mother and his mother's sisters. Mary, the wife of Clopas, John 19-25. Jesus' aunt here, also a daughter of Heli, of the line of Nathan, is widely acknowledged from the scriptural context to be the mother of James, the less of Joseph. Mark 15-40. See verses 47, Matthew 27:56. James the less is understood to be one of the two of the original 12 apostles named James. James the son of Alphaeus. James Paul Gardner, editor, The Complete Who's Who in the Bible, 1995, page 294. And there is yet another New Testament figure who appears to have been a close relative of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea. The place name he's identified with occurs in the Old Testament as the home of the prophet Samuel. Arimathea Zophim, 1 Samuel 1:1. The Septuagint Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures renders the italicized word as Arimatheum, also known by its shortened form Ramah. This village is apparently synonymous with modern Ramallah, a town about 5 miles north of Jerusalem. Referred to as a rich man and a prominent council member, Joseph was a good and just man who had not consented to the kangaroo trial that condemned Jesus. See Matthew 27:57-60, Mark 15:42-46, and Luke 23:50-53. After Christ's death, Joseph, being a disciple of Jesus, was secretly, for fear of the Jews, asked the Roman governor Pontius Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. John 19:3-8. Then after preparing it for burial, Joseph laid the body in a rock-hewn tomb in a garden. The tomb was obviously owned by Joseph, as the Messiah was prophesied to be buried in a rich man's grave. See Isaiah 53:9. Mark says that Joseph went boldly to Pilate to request the body of Jesus. Mark 15-43. And just in time, Barnes noted in the New Testament comments, unless there had been a special application to Pilate in behalf of Jesus, his body would have been buried that night in the common grave with the malefactors with whom he'd been crucified, for it was a law of the Jews that the body of an executed man should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath. John 19:31. At this critical juncture, God called forward the secret disciple. 1970 note on Mark 15:43. Evidence of Joseph's kinship. But on what grounds did Joseph claim the body? Not on his being a disciple, for in the same context we read that he took the pains to conceal the fact out of the fear of the Jews. Yet how do we square this with the boldness of his request? Let us consider what exactly Joseph was afraid of. It could be that he was concerned the Jews would come after him as they had Jesus. Perhaps fear of reprisal had kept him from revealing that he was a disciple in the past, and his boldness now was in taking an action that revealed him for what he was. However, there is another way to understand Joseph's specific fear in this instance and his action taken. We later discover that under no circumstances did the Jewish authorities want Jesus' body to fall into the hands of his disciples, out of worry that the disciples would dispense with it and concoct a resurrection fable. Matthew 27:62-66. Thus Joseph likely feared in approaching Pilate that if it became known he was a disciple, the Jewish authorities would pressure the governor into refusing Joseph's request for Christ's body. Therefore, it seems that Joseph must have approached Pilate on some other basis. Simple friendship with Jesus? No. Besides appearing as patronage and discipleship, there would have been another hurdle to jump. The Sanhedrin had declared Jesus a criminal according to both Roman and Jewish law, unless the body of an executed criminal was immediately claimed by the next of kin. The body of the victim was cast into a common pit, whereas with others, all physical record of them was completely obliterated. Certainly, the fanatical Sadducean element of Sanhedrin, who sought the total extinction of Jesus, even in death, would have allowed nothing short of a legal claim on the body of Christ. The Jewish authorities, who hated and despised Jesus, would surely have resisted his being given an honourable burial in a private tomb, unless there were irrefutable grounds in favour of Joseph receiving the body. Therefore, we may infer from these verses that Joseph was a close relative of Jesus. This probably accounts for the boldness of Joseph's request. Not bold in the sense of facing his fears, but bold because it was an assertion of his rights to Christ's body. No other family member of Jesus are mentioned as coming forward. His legal father Joseph, last mentioned when Jesus was 12 years old, had evidently died long before, Jesus being referred to in Nazareth as the carpenter, the son of Mary, Mark 6-3. Mary herself was in no state to deal with the matter, and this would not have been a woman's responsibility anyway. Jesus' brothers were probably in their 20s or teens, perhaps considered too young to assume responsibility over the family, and thus take care of this unsavoury business, or they could have been away, or were perhaps simply afraid to be associated with Jesus at this time. In then steps Joseph of Arimathea, again, evidently a close relative. By some traditions, this wealthy relative had become an adoptive father of the family after the death of Mary's husband Joseph. More specifically, Joseph of Arimathea is by Eastern Orthodox tradition said to have been the younger brother of the father of the Virgin Mary, thus making him Mary's uncle and Jesus' great-uncle. Mary's father, Heli, was essentially a royal prince of the Davidic line of Nathan. Excuse me. And so would Heli's brother have been. So Joseph of Arimathea may well have been of royal blood. Some claim an earlier tradition reckoned Joseph as the brother of Mary and thus Jesus' direct uncle, which would still have made him of the same family. The noble Decurio. Joseph was, as we've seen, described as a prominent council member, Mark 15:43. The original Greek here is Euschemon Boulets. The Amplified Bible gives this as noble and honourable in rank and a respected member of the council. The first Greek word here can mean noble in character or evidently in birth. The women who are incited against the apostle Paul in Acts 13-50 are prominent Euschemon, as are those in Acts 17:12. They belong to a higher social stratum, Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. Of the second word we are told regarding Joseph, he is also called by St. Mark and St. Luke as Bouletes, literally a senator, whereby is meant a member of the Sanhedrin or Supreme Council of the Jews. Joseph of Arimathea, the Catholic Encyclopedia, 1910. Yet, because this is a non-Jewish designation for the council, Logos software note on Mark applied to advisors of Gentile officials in Acts 25:12. Some say Joseph's office was in the Roman state and that he was one of Pilate's privy council, but his post rather seems to have been as one of the great Sanhedrin of the Jews. Matthew Henry's commentary on the Bible. This we understand from Luke's comment that Joseph did not vote with them to condemn Christ. Luke 23-50. Still, the Greek words Euschemon, Bouletes, or Bouletes, could be properly read as noble senator in the Roman world of the first century. In fact, even in this case, since the term Senate could denote governing councils of subject nations such as the Sanhedrin, Senatus, the Roman Senate, but used also similar bodies in other nations. Senatus, the classic Latin dictionary, 1941. However, when the Catholic Church Father Jerome produced in the late 300s the first version of the Vulgate, the earliest Latin translation of the Bible, he rendered the Greek words above as nobilis decuro. In the words nobilis, we can obviously see the English word noble, but what of the Latin word decurio? Besides being a military title, decurio was applied to a member of the local council or senate of a colonia, a community established by Roman citizens and having full citizenship rights. A municipium, a cooperation and community established by non-Romans but granted certain rights of citizenship. Qualifications were numerous and the position was regarded as an honour. The decurions had wide powers in local administration, finance and judiciary proceedings. Decurio, Encyclopedia Britannica, Micropedia. Perhaps Jerome had access to more information about Joseph. The apocryphal Gospel of Peter says Joseph was a friend of Pilate. Information in such sources is often inaccurate, but it's entirely possible that Pilate knew and respected him, which may have added to his readiness to hand over Jesus' body. Of course, this alone would not have been enough to secure the body. In any event, it seems that Joseph was a man of considerable means, not just wealthy, but also quite influential. In medieval tradition, he is called Joseph de Marmor, which may bear on that. Some recognize marmor as a Greek and Latin word, marmor meaning marble or perhaps quarried stone. Abingdon's strong, exhaustive Concordance of the Bible, Greek Dictionary of the New Testament, 1981, Marmor Classical Latin. Others see Marmor as a place name. There's La Marmor, the highest peak in Sardinia, the Sea of Marmor between the Aegean and Black Seas, and the Roman province of Libya in North Africa known as Monarchy, all of these evidently named after marble. Yet there may be another possibility. Joseph seems to have been a wealthy nobleman of Judah with broad influence, certain rights of citizenship, and perhaps even a high enough social standing to have regular personal interaction with the Roman governor. Indeed, by tradition, he appears to have been a royal prince of the line of David, which would have given him even further status with the Jews. Is it possible, then, that Marmor was actually a title reflective of Joseph's status? In Hebrew, the words Mer Mora would mean Lord Dread or Dread Lord, Hebrew and Chaldee Dictionary. That is, a lord to be properly feared and respected. Such a title made its way into more recent times. Note how the Pilgrims referred to the British king in the Mayflower Compact of 1620. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God. Indeed, this has been a rather common way of addressing kings for millennia. If Joseph bore such a title, it is conceivable that the medieval authors, who would likely not have understood it, wrote it down as Marmor, thinking of it as a place he identified with, or perhaps they considered it to mean quarried stone, maybe drawing a connection between quarrying and a rather strong tradition surrounding Joseph, his involvement in tin mining in southern Britain. Glastonbury traditions. We should consider the traditions connecting Joseph with Britain. Regarding him, the Encyclopedia Britannica states, according to all four Gospels, a secret disciple of Jesus, whose body he buried in his own tomb. Joseph is accorded a long history in later literature, much of it mythical, in Robert de Boron's verse romance Joseph de Arimathea, c. 1200. He is entrusted with the Holy Grail cup of the Last Supper, a mid-13th century interpolation, a textual alteration believed by scholars to have been made to a 12th century work by English historian William of Malmesbury, relates that Joseph went to Glastonbury in Somerset, England, as head of 12 missionaries dispatched there by the Apostle St. Philip. Joseph of Arimathea, Saint, 1985, Micropedia. It is generally agreed that William's original did mention the mission sent by Philip, and the Glastonbury's founding went back to the time of Christ. Glastonbury is identified by many as the mysterious Isle of Avalon in the sources of King Arthur. Notice this regarding the remains of an old church there. Glastonbury Abbey, a ruined abbey in Somersetshire, about 6 miles south of Wales, England. Tradition has it that here that Joseph of Arimathea established the first Christian church in England. By the way, guys, this first Christian church was meant to be the first Christian church in the world above ground that was established. Goes the myth. The Encyclopedia Britannica states, according to the legends, the first church of Glastonbury was a little wattled or thatched building erected by Joseph of Arimathea as the leader of the 12 apostles, that is the 12 missionaries mentioned earlier, sent over to Britain from Gaul by Saint Philip from Gaul, France. There's the Gaels, the Gauls, the Galli, the Gallics. And I've got a whole video for them. I've been studying them. An old saying from the English countryside, believed to be a refrain of an ancient miner's song, maintains that Joseph was a tin man. Indeed, as mentioned, this is understood to mean that he was involved in tin mining and, more importantly, the tin trade with the Mediterranean. Many believe that he actually came often to Britain during the life of Jesus, perhaps even before, and that after Christ's death and resurrection, Joseph came again, this time as an evangelist. This whole story sounds fabulous, to be sure, yet was it a complete invention of the late Middle Ages, or was it a tradition that went further back? And could there be some actual truth in it? So what do you think, people? It's a nice story. To answer the first part, there appears to have been a reference to Joseph being at Glastonbury from a certain Melkin identified as Melgwyn of Llandaff, ruler of Gwynedd of North Wales, who was educated at the same school. The well-known early British historian Gildas was John of Glaston. There, Glastonbury's Abbey late historian, writing at the beginning of the 15th century, quotes in support of the actual burial of Joseph in the cemetery there. An ancient British historian named Melkin, who lived before Merlin, the historical Welsh bard Myrddin, and wrote concerning the mission of St. Philip's disciples that they died in succession and were buried in the cemetery. Amongst them, Joseph of Marmor, named of Arimathea, received a perpetual sleep, and he lies in Linnea by Furcata, near the south corner of the oratory, which is built of hurdles, wattle. It is worth remarking here that when Henry VIII's royal antiquarian John Leland visited Glastonbury about 1540, Abbot Whiting admitted him to the library of the monastery, in which he found a fragment of Melkin's history, Historiolium de Rebus Britannicus, an author, as he tells us, entirely unknown to him. He read this fragment with great interest and pleasure and found in it the very narrative quoted above. Doubtless the manuscript was the identical one employed by John of Glaston, whose chronicle was unknown to Leland. Melkin was placed by Leland in his catalogue of British writers and figures accordingly in the works of his copyists. If legitimate, this puts the first known historical mention of Joseph at Glastonbury 700 years before the mention generally accepted as first by modern scholarship. Tin mines of southern England. What, then, of any truth in the stories? As elsewhere pointed out in this publication, the tin trade with Britain had been going on since the days of the Phoenicians. In the ancient Mediterranean world, the British Isles was referred to as the Cassiterides, the Tin Islands, the primary source, along with Spain, of Mediterranean tin. This was still the case in Roman days. The Cornish tin mines of Cornwall in southwest England were famous by the time Romans conquered Great Britain in the 21st century AD. Other metals were mined in Britain as well. Specimens of Roman British lead from the Mendip mines near Glastonbury have been found in various parts of the Roman Empire. About 1950, an ancient Roman drain pipe bonded with lead was found at Ostia, the seaport of Rome. Analysis showed the lead had been mined in the Mendips. Furthermore, there is evidence that Jews were involved with some of these mines, as explained by Dr. Bernard Susser, a Jewish rabbi, in his 1993 book, The Jews of Southwest England, originally written in his 1977 PhD thesis at the University of Exeter in England is available online. In it, he states, Jewish settlement in Devon and Cornwall, the two most southern-westerly counties of Great Britain, began in the remote mists of biblical and Roman times. The presence of smelting ovens in Cornwall and Devon, which are called Jews' houses or Jews' houses, may point to early Jewish participation in the mining industry. This type of oven was in use from the 2nd century BC until about 1350 AD and was called by the 18th century tinners a Jew house. The tin from a Jew's house was known as Jew's house tin. Jews may have at least one well-established trading centre in Cornwall in the pre-Roman period, as the town Marazion, the name itself suggestive of Hebraic origin, meaning either site of Zion or bitterness of Zion, was anciently known as Market Jew, and the main street of Penzance, which leads it to it, is even today called Market Jew Street. Nor is the only town in Cornwall whose name is said to be Hebraic in its origin. There is also the village of Menhenwa, which name a correspondent to the Jewish Chronicle suggested is derived from the two Hebrew words min on yacht, which means from ships. It is worth noting that much of the evidence which points to Jewish settlement or influence in Britain during the pre-Roman period relates in the main to Devon and Cornwall. Jews in Roman Britain. The Roman period began when Julius Caesar invaded in 55 BC, defeating native forces the following year. Although Britain wasn't truly Romanized for some time, the inhabitants, referred to collectively as Britons, maintained political freedom and paid tribute to Rome for almost a century before the Roman Emperor Claudius I initiated the systematic conquest of Britain in 43 AD. By 47, Roman legions had occupied all the island south of the Humber River and east of the Severn River. The tribes, notably the Silures, whom we'll see further mention of shortly, inhabitants of what are now the Wales and Yorkshire regions, resisted stubbornly for more than 30 years, a period that was marked by the abortive and bloody rebellion in 61, led by the native Queen Boudica. At this time, Britain became an imperial province of Rome called Britannia, administered by Roman governors. About 79 Roman legions subdued the tribes in Wales and established partial control over those in Yorkshire. Dr. Susser discusses this period. Were there Jews in Roman Britain? This question has been considered by Dr. Applebaum, and that there are some Jewish traders who were connected with the import of pottery, glass, and Oriental Eastern Mediterranean wares. They may have been formed small communities in Colchester, York, Corbridge, and London. Archaeological evidence relates to finds of coins and pottery. According to Dr. Applebaum, Near Eastern coins of Roman period found in Dorset and Devon show an early connection between those areas. A close analysis of these coins indicate that Exeter was one of the first ports of call for sea traffic coming from the Mediterranean Cup up the Channel. Analysis of the coins also shows that they mainly originate from Antioch, Chalkis, Sirius, Hierapolis, Edessa, Samosata, Zegma, and Zingara, all of the towns with a high percentage of Jews in the population. The particularly strong link between Exeter and the Near East makes it likely that there were some early Jewish associations with that city. Dr. Susser further says, a persistent legend also refers to the presence of at least one Jew in England at the beginning of the Christian era. He was Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy Essene Jew who, it is said, out of sympathy with Jesus, gave him burial in a rock tomb near Jerusalem. Jewish Encyclopedia. A variant of the legend makes Joseph travel through Cornwall, accompanied by Jesus. This legend may be the folk memory of some ancient time when one or more notable Jews visited England. Thus, we return once again to Joseph of Arimathea. Perhaps besides being a Davidic lord and a noble council member, he was also a merchant prince, made rich through the trade of metal from Britain and in turn pottery and glass from the Middle East. Among his distinctions, this one would have given him the greatest standing with the Romans and may well have put him in regular contact with Pontius Pilate. Furthermore, if all of this is true, it provides a good reason for Joseph being in Britain after the death and resurrection of Christ. He could have been continuing in his former trade, all the while spreading word of what had happened in Judea, or perhaps he was strictly an evangelist at this time, yet went to this place familiar to him, where he had important contacts. So I wonder if Christianity began in Britain because Joseph took the body back, tell everybody the story, and suddenly he was a martyr. He became a martyr over in Britain after the burial of his body, and then Christianity became a thing. I think Celtic Christianity formed from maybe these stories, either of tribes or Joseph of Arimathea. There's definitely a connection with Israel and Britain and the royalty. Apostolic journeys. And there are other good reasons why Joseph and even others of Christ's original followers may have gone to Britain. When Jesus first commissioned his apostles, he told them, "Do not go into the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter a city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Now this is likely applied in part to the spiritually lost Jews in the Holy Land, but it would seem to primarily identify the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Of course, Jesus later told his apostles to take his message to all nations, and salvation was opened to the Gentiles. But still the gospel message was to be for the Jew Israelite first, and also for the Greek Gentile. All of this seems to indicate that the primary target for evangelism was to be the Israelites. Even Paul, the apostles to the Gentiles, was also commissioned to preach to the children of Israel. In any case, to the people of Christ's day, all nations would certainly have applied to the breadth of the Roman Empire and beyond, and the lost tribes of Israel were at that time located along the entire length of the northern border of the empire, stretching from Parthia and Scythia in the east all the way to Spain and France and Britain in the west. In the early 300s, the renowned church historian Eusebius wrote in his well-known history of the church, "The holy apostles and disciples of our Saviour were scattered all over the world. Thomas, tradition tells us, was chosen for Parthia, Andrew for Scythia, John for Asia." That's interesting there, Andrew for Scythia, because Scotland's saint is St. Andrew, and there's connection with Scotland and Scythia. So that's interesting. Andrew for Scythia, John for Asia Minor, where he remained till his death at Ephesus. Peter seems to have preached in Pontus, Galatia, and Bithynia, Cappadocia, and Asia to the Jews, or rather Israelites, of the dispersion. Paul specifically mentioned his intention to go to Spain. Might he have gone? In another of his works, Eusebius wrote, "The apostles passed beyond the ocean to the isles called the Britannic Isles." He didn't mention which apostles, but it is so fantastical to imagine that some did. After all, going from Judea to Britain was nothing more than traversing the empire. Consider the myriads of people moved from the eastern United States to the western territories in pioneer days by wagon, and travel was accomplished by stagecoach. Yet travel from the Holy Land to Britain would have been far easier and faster, because the distance could be covered over water by sailing ship and over land by Roman roads, which were well maintained. The earliest generally acknowledged historian of Britain, Gildas the Wise, already mentioned, writing around 550, stated, "We certainly know that Christ, the true Son, offered his light, the knowledge of his precepts, to our island in the last year of Tiberius Caesar." Tiberius died in March of AD 37, so Gildas says that within 6 years of Jesus' death and resurrection, the gospel was already planted in Britain. This was well before the apostles dispersed throughout the known world and established congregations outside the Holy Land. But it does correspond to the terrible persecution brought on by the church by Paul prior to his conversion around AD 35. But was Joseph of Arimathea among those who arrived? In 4 Catholic councils in the early 1400s, it was determined that France and Spain had to yield in points of antiquity and precedence to Britain, as its church was founded by Joseph of Arimathea immediately after the death and resurrection of Christ. That's interesting. Interesting indeed. Legend and perspective. Catholic Cardinal Caesar Baranius, who was appointed curator of the Vatican Library in 1597, mentions Joseph in an interesting context. In his monumental Annals Ecclesiasticae, Annals of the Church, under the year AD 35, he describes a sea voyage in a boat without oars by the disciples Lazarus, Mary Magdalene, Martha, their servant Marcella, and another disciple named Maximinus, who eventually put ashore at Marseille in southern France. For this information, Baronius footnotes Acts of Magdalene and associated works. Indeed, as David Mykov states in his introduction to the life of St. Mary Magdalene and of her sister Martha, a medieval biography, this basic story was evidently contained in a number of documents going back to at least the 9th century, many of which have Lazarus and Mary Magdalene then spreading the gospel in southern France. These and other traditions came together to form the document he translates in his above book, attributed in a manuscript from around 1408 to the 9th century abbot Rabanus Maurus, but believed by scholars including Mykov to date from the late 12th century. This document lists the passengers of the boat as Maximinus the Archbishop, along with the glorious friend of God, Mary Magdalene, her sister, the blessed Martha, and the blessed Archdeacon Parmenas, and the bishops Trophimus and Eutropius, together with the rest of the leaders of the army of Christ. Baronius goes a step further, citing in a footnote that he refers to as historical English manuscript that is held in the Vatican Library. He says that this partly separated, some then accompanying Joseph of Arimathea, the noble decurio, to Britain, where the cardinal had not originally mentioned him with the others. It is interesting that Joseph shows up in the narrative. But did this really happen? There's no way to know for sure, of course. It does fit the time frame of Gildas regarding the gospel coming to Britain at the end of Tiberius's reign. Yet there are problems with the scenario. For one, the traditions connecting Lazarus to southern France are rather questionable, likely to have been derived from 5th century bishop of the era named Lazarus, who spent time in the Holy Land before returning to live out his days in Marseille. However, it is possible that this person was intentionally following in his footsteps of his namesake, so to speak. Furthermore, one might wonder why the Catholic councils of the early 1400s considered the British Church to be older than that of France, if evangelizing began first in southern France. This reason alone makes it appear that Joseph was not associated with the boat without oars at the time of these councils. What seems more likely is that Baronius conflated two traditions into one, or took his information from an earlier conflation. This did not take away from Joseph's earlier arrival in Britain. Indeed, it is remarkable that, even considering these traditions regarding Lazarus and Mary Magdalene in southern France at an early date, the church councils still decide that Joseph's early presence in England gave Britain the honour of oldest congregation outside the Holy Land. Certain of the apostles were also reported by tradition to have visited Britain over the course of the next few decades following Tiberius' death. Among them, Simon the Zealot, Peter and Paul. Yet all of the traditions, Joseph's are the most prominent, mainly because of their involvement with the Holy Grail of the Arthurian romances. What was the Grail? There are several interpretations. It is likely the Grail legend sprang from a number of sources that came interwoven, some of them pagan. Yet the most popular form of the Grail in legend is that of the sacred cup of the Last Supper, with which Joseph is said to have caught drops of Christ's blood from the cross, and that drinking from this cup brought healing and perpetual life. Perhaps we can recognize in all of this a rather obvious corruption of something scriptural. On the night before his death, at his final Passover with his disciples, Jesus presented a cup of wine as representative of his shed blood for sin to initiate the new covenant. As elsewhere said to have, whoever drank his blood would have eternal life. Consider that if Joseph conducted a Passover in the midst of a pagan land, word could have easily gotten around to this effect. Joseph has a cup that Jesus shed blood in it. If you drink from it, you'll live forever. Possibly in Joseph's repeating of Christ's words, this cup is a new covenant in my blood. Some mistakenly thought he was using the very same cup, and thus was perhaps born the Grail legend, or at least most well-known version of it. Of course, we must be very cautious about accepting anything from legend as having any real substance. though legends do often contain a kernel of truth. Reconciling dates. Returning to events, what has already been referred to as the 13th century interpolation in William of Malmesbury's text, we are told that Joseph crossed from France to Britain in the year 63 at the behest of the Apostle Philip. While this could be entirely fictional, it could also indicate a genuine tradition, even if it were inserted into William's text by the monks of Glastonbury, as scholars argue. It would not necessarily mean that Joseph had not earlier been in Britain. Indeed, perhaps he did arrive in Britain around 37, but later went back to the European continent and perhaps even all the way back to the Holy Land before later being sent out to Britain again. It could be that he even went more than once. This would not be too surprising, considering that Joseph, if the traditions be true, had made such journeys numerous times before. It is also possible that Joseph did come with larger company until 63. Joseph could have even been a traveller on the boat without oars after all, albeit at a later time than he originally came to Britain. A. Raymond, captain, favouring the early arrival of Joseph's company in Britain and basing his comments on other recorded traditions, says, Joseph and his companions were met by King Arvigas of the Silurian dynasty of Britain. He was the son of King Cunobelinus, the Cymbeline of Shakespeare, and a cousin to the renowned British warrior Caradoc, whom the Romans renamed Caraticus. Captain infers undoubtedly Arvigas and Joseph were well known to each other. Joseph's business as a metal merchant for the Romans would have brought him in contact with the king on more than one occasion. Later, King Arvigas was to play an important role in the struggle against Roman dominance in Britain. According to the timeline laid out in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of Kings of Britain, Arviragus would have been the king at this time. However, Arviragus, who is mentioned by the later Roman satirist Juvenal, seems to be a later king reigning at the time of Emperor Domitian, around 50 years after Joseph's supposed arrival. To better see the difficulty of sorting out the period, see Luke Stevens' speculation of British genealogy and history and antiquity and literary transmission thereof. Yet some have proposed Arviragus as a title similar to Ard Rai, the Irish Gaelic term meaning High King, and see it as applicable to all early British High Kings, including Caradoc. Others have made Arviragus and Caradoc cousins, even co-rulers. Of course, the various British tribes had their own lesser kings at this time. Exactly who was reigning and where during this murky period of Britain's past is uncertain, records then being a matter of bardic oral traditions. Joseph is said to have converted Arviragus to Christianity, whichever ruler he was. Of course, it could be that nothing of the sort actually happened, or perhaps he converted some important person, and this was later reported to be the king. Amazingly, there is actual scriptural evidence, in light of known history, that seems to verify that some members of the British royal family of this period actually were converted, but whether this happened in Britain or not is uncertain. Royal converts. When Paul later lived as a prisoner in Rome around the early 60s AD, he mentions those of Caesar's household who were members of the church in Rome. He also mentions Pudens, Linus, and Claudia as prominent members there. From Roman history, it appears these verses are referring to the same people. Claudia, the adopted daughter of the former Emperor Claudius, had been converted along with her husband Pudens and brother Linus. Claudia, whose birth name was Gladys, was the daughter of the British High King Caradoc, who was captured in the Romano-British War. Her extraordinary beauty, celebrated later by the Roman poet Martial, and her keen intellect so affected Claudius that he adopted her as his own daughter. Her husband, Rufus Pudentius, commonly called Pudens, was a Roman senator and former aide-de-camp of Aulus Plautius, one of the most famous and brilliant military commanders of his day, and the commander Claudius sent to Britain in AD 43 to reduce the island to submission. When did these people become Christians? Some say it was due to Paul's preaching in Rome, but a good case is made that they were already Christians in Rome when Paul first arrived there. Thus, it is possible that they were converted previously while still in Britain, where Joseph of Arimathea is said to have interacted with the British High King. In fact, Joseph is associated with the medieval romances with another British ruler called Bronze, who is often identified as Bran the Blessed, believed by some to have also been a Christian convert. It should be mentioned that many scholars consider Bran to be mythical because of outlandish legends surrounding him, and they identify him as a Celtic god. Yet this is often the fallback of a modern academia when it comes to sorting out ancient Celtic rulers, usually a reasonable position, but one that often proves incorrect since these certainly were important people throughout those times and traditions did accumulate around many of them. Bran appears in genealogies that many consider generally legitimate. Morgan explains, in the clan times, the preservation of pedigree meant the preservation of all that was valuable in blood, station, and property. Without it, a man was an outlaw. He had no clan, consequently no legal rights or status. Genealogies were guarded, therefore with extreme jealousy, and recorded with painful exactitude by the herald bards of each clan. On the public reception, at the age of 15, of a child into the clan, his family genealogy was proclaimed, and all of the challengers to it commanded to come forward. Pedigree and inheritance, indeed, were so identified in the ancient British code that an heir, even in the ninth descent, could redeem at a jury valuation any portion of an hereditary estate from which necessity had it compelled his forefathers to part. Morgan then gives Caradoc's genealogy from the Welsh Patawind manuscripts of Lansanor, Cardagoc, Brian Fenegad the Blessed. He also quotes the medieval Welsh triads of the island of Britain, Bran, son of Lir Ladiath, who brought the faith of Christ to the Cymry, the Welsh, from Rome, where he had been 7 years a hostage for his son Caradoc, whom the Romans put in prison. Furthermore, Morgan quotes from an ancient Welsh proverb, "House that heard saying of Caradoc, the exalted son of the noble Bran. Oppression persisted and brings on death." Bran, then, was very likely the father of Caradoc and grandfather of Claudia and Linus, and, as mentioned, he appeared to have interacted with Joseph of Arimathea. 12 hides of land. We may also notice that Joseph's religious commission appears to have obtained substantial favour with the British authorities. King Avaragus, whichever king he actually was, is recorded as having granted to Joseph and his followers 12 hides of land, about 1,900 acres, tax-free, in Eunice Written, Isle of Glass, Glastonbury. Confirmation of this royal charter is found in the official Domesday Book of Britain, the National Survey commissioned by William the Conqueror in AD 1086, which states, "This Glastonbury church possesses, in its own villa, 12 hides of land which have never paid tax." So it's recorded in the Domesday Book. It could well be that this granting of territory is when the interpolated date of AD 63 actually applied to. Perhaps Joseph and his company had settled in the Glastonbury area upon their arrival in 37, but weren't actually given the land there until this later time. Or perhaps Joseph had come on his own, or just with a few people in 37, went back to the Holy Land and came back with others in this later time of 63. In intervening years, Rome would have invaded the island again, starting in 43, as we've already seen. This would have frankly been a good reason to leave Britain. But amazingly, the Romans were stopped from conquering the western extremes of Britain by Boudicca's rebellion of 61. The rebellion also freed part of the island where Glastonbury was from the Roman dominion, and the area continued under British sovereignty then for almost 2 decades. It is interesting to note that the year 63, when the land grant to Joseph is supposed to have occurred, came just 2 years after the rebellion. Historian Geoffrey Ashe is rather sceptical of the Joseph legends, admits rather regarding the story of Joseph and his company settling at Glastonbury in Somerset. What is so piquant is that whoever started the tale should have hit so neatly on a time when British chief may actually have been holding central Somerset and able to give the wanderers a haven until the Cadbury Hill fort, nearby thought by some to later be the Camelot of Arthur, was excavated. There was no evidence for unconquered Britons in that area so long after the Roman invasion. A linkage of legends may be hinted at in fact that Bran appears as Braun or Bronze, accompanying Joseph in romances of the Holy Grail. These stories and the passage in Gildas all seem to be hovering around the notion that there were Christians in Britain, very few, with no serious impact in the immediate post-Boudica phase. Kings and queens of early Britain. Yet, they might have had quite an impact. Though disputed, the nation may have been heavily Christianized within a few decades by what was likely the same royal family in the person of King Lucius, and, if that's so, likely due in part to groundwork laid at Glastonbury. Of course, we don't know how faithful to the truth the latter converts would have been. In that regard, it is interesting to note that what happened 500 years later when the Roman Catholic priest Augustine came to convert the British, who still held to their own form of Christianity. Anglo-Saxon historian Bede, himself a Catholic, wrote regarding the year 603, "Now the Britons did not keep Easter at the correct time, but between the 14th and 20th days of the moon. Furthermore, certain other of their customs were at variance with the universal practice of the Church. But despite protracted discussions, neither the prayers, advice, or censures of Augustine and his companions could obtain the compliance of the Britons, who stubbornly preferred their own customs to those in universal use among Christians, i.e. Catholic churches." So in other words, the Catholic Church tried to put in their own forms of Easter and probably their own calendar, the Roman calendar as well, and there was already a Celtic Christianity there, probably quite established by the sounds of it, if the people were so stubborn to let go of it. Bede then describes how the British started to make an about-face after Augustine supposedly performed a miracle of healing, yet kept holding to their old ways. In any case, the practice described above appears to have been derived, at least in part, from the original apostles who observed the Passover and Feast of the Unleavened Bread from the 14th to 21st day of the first month of the Hebrew calendar, and our free booklet. Considering the apostasy that enveloped most of the Christian world by the 2nd century, Britain's isolated continuance in such early church practices adds to the strong likelihood that the gospel was preached in the island by some of Christ's early followers. Other references. Thus, with such prevalent traditions surrounding Joseph of Arimathea's presence in southern England in the 1st century AD and numerous corroborating factors, it seems quite probable, though we may not be able to know the specifics of what happened, that he really was there. There are numerous sources available that provide even further corroboration, evidence to the effect. A few are given here, some that have already been cited. Please bear in mind that a recommendation of outside sources for further study is not an endorsement of all that is contained within these sources. Indeed, there are statements in the reference material which we would strongly disagree. Nevertheless, the following items do contain valuable and pertinent information on subject at hand, and also refer to other sources. So there's some of the sources there, if you want to look up, guys. Joseph found dynasties. I'll take a quick drink, guys. A dry mouth. What then does all this have to do with the throne of David? How does it actually relate to the British monarchy? Consider that Joseph's proclamation of the gospel would have included the fact that Jesus was of the royal line of David, and if Joseph were Jesus' great uncle, the British would have understood him to be royalty as well. Indeed, from the prior dealings with this merchant prince, it's possible that the British kings already knew as much. They at least surely recognised him as a noble of great importance. In their eyes, this would have made him and his family candidates for intermarriage with British royalty. In that light, it is remarkable to find in the Grail stories that Joseph founded a line of kings. Most of the information in these stories is certainly fictitious, but there are probably some kernels of truth embedded within them. As again is often the case with legends, around 1212, Robert de Boron wrote in his work of Joseph of Arimathea that Jesus appeared to Joseph and gave him the secrets of the Saviour, which were only to be shared with the family of the Grail. This is obviously fictional, but the family is prevalent in the stories. Later, as Joseph is dying, the voice of the Holy Spirit speaks to him, telling him that he has established a lineage which will continue until, in far-off time, one will come who shall achieve the Grail. This is the Arthurian knight, Percival. In the same text, we find references to Joseph's brother, Bronze, who receives the name of the rich fisherman after he feeds the company of the Grail from a single fish, a clearly enough reference of the miracle of the loaves and fishes from the biblical tradition. Interestingly, of course, Bronze is a name which derives from Bran. Joseph is seen to be a brother, at least related to the British king Bran. A slightly earlier work about Percival called Parzival was composed by a Bavarian knight named Wolfram von Eschenbach. It is vastly elaborated and threaded through with a huge and mysterious symbolic structure involving numerology and the precise organization of the chapters so that the story spirals inwards to the center and outwards again to the end. Much ink had been spilled in attempts to crack Wolfram's code and arrive at a deeper, more esoteric meaning within. You need to check that out, Wolfram's code. In Wolfram's story, The Grail, it is not a cup, but a mysterious stone which sustains its guardians, the lineage of the mystical Grail family. Commenting on Parzival, John Matthews, an acknowledged expert in Arthurian tradition, states, Wolfram here, in particular passage, seems to be speaking of a physical succession, perhaps even an elite body of people who are bred to serve the Grail in a wholly calculated way. He also indicates that the disposition of the Grail lineage is a secret known only to the angels. A little later, the collection of Arthurian stories referred to as the Vulgate Cycle was published. In an introduction to the first book, History of the Holy Grail, the focus of attention shifts rapidly from Joseph of Arimathea to his son Josephus and thence to a converted pagan prince named Nassians. In a lengthy adventure, the latter finds himself on an island. A ship appears in which a rich bed, a golden crown, and a sword of magnificent workmanship. Documents explain that these had once belonged to the biblical King David. The ship had been constructed by Solomon. Again, this is clearly fictional, but the references to David and Solomon should pique our interests. Secrets and corruptions. In Wolfram's Parzival, the Grail Guardians are referred to as the Templacen, which may have seen a reference to the medieval Knights Templar who ruled Jerusalem during the Crusades and established a network of castles throughout Europe. Though there is no actual proof, it is widely believed that Wolfram himself was a Templar and that he was hiding a secret Templar knowledge in his work. Further, many identify the Templars as the source of Scottish Freemasonry. In that regard, it is perhaps significant that most kings of Scotland and England have apparently been Masons, and that one of the traditional Masonic beliefs is that the House of David was transferred to northwest of Europe from the Holy Land, as noted in Algeron's Herbert's Britannia after Romans. Some actually accuse the Masons of deceptively originating the idea of supposed connections between the House of David and the British monarchy, but although they may have been recognised early, they clearly did not manufacture all the evidence in this regard, which stands on its own merit. We certainly do not look at the Masons as the source of our beliefs on this matter. Rather, we look first and foremost to scripture and then to secular history and widespread tradition, which support the link. Anyway, with Wolfram's story as background, some have concluded that the Holy Grail of Christ's blood, represented by a stone, is actually the bloodline of David through the family of Jesus, from which the lineage of British kings has sprung. In fact, some have even argued that this royal bloodline came through Jesus himself, who they claim did not die on the cross but married Mary Magdalene and fathered children by her. This teaching is, of course, contrary to Scripture and utterly nefarious, flying in the face of the whole purpose and plan of God. Yet it could be a terrible corruption of something true and factual, as false doctrine often is. Perhaps the bloodline of David was transferred to Europe through Jesus' extended family and not Jesus himself. Certainly, we have seen evidence that the Solomonic line was transferred to Ireland at the time of Jeremiah, but this other transfer would involve the line of David's son Nathan. It should be noted that the royal transfer could not have come through Christ's brothers, for while they were the line of both Solomon and Nathan, the lineage from Jeconiah through their father Joseph, which Jesus did not share, prevented them or their descendants from ruling. Compare Matthew 1, 6-16, Jeremiah 22, 24-30. But other family on the mother's side would have sufficed, including Joseph of Arimathea. To examine this possibility, we turn to the last source in our list above, the Royal House of Britain, an enduring dynasty by Milner. He mentions King Arthur was descended from Arviragus. It should be pointed out that Arthur has not been clearly identified historically. However, it is well worth accepted in scholarship that he actually existed as a British ruler of the 5th or 6th century, following the end of Roman rule, since tribal leadership was maintained even during the period of the Romans. It is quite likely that Arthur was descended from the dynasties of the early Roman period. Citing another source, Milner also notes, we find in John of Glastonbury, writes, some verses and a couple of genealogies showing King Arthur's descent on his mother's side from Joseph, which I here subjoin. Helios Nepos, nephew or grandson of Joseph, Genwat begot Josu. Josu Genwat Abinab, and son unto Arthur. The second genealogy derives from the husband of Arthur's sister, from a Petrus, who was consanguineous, blood related to Joseph of Arimathea. These independent lists prove, or at least help to substantiate, that Joseph did start dynasties in Britain. And here it may be noted that the original meaning of the Latin nepos is not nephew, but grandson. See White and Riddle's Latin Dictionary. Notice Joseph's supposed grandson, Helios, in the genealogy. He seems to be synonymous with the Helios le Gros, Heli the Great, of the medieval romances. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his History of the Kings of Britain, gave the name Heli to the father of Cassivellaunus, the British king at the time of Julius Caesar. Yet this person was too early to have been a grandson of Joseph of Arimathea. Old Welsh tales mention Abeli the Great, who may consider synonymous with Geoffrey Heli. British relations to Mary. Notice what historian Geoffrey Ash says. Medieval texts such as the collection of Welsh tales called the Mabinogion have preserved a fair amount of Celtic mythical tradition. Welsh legends, for instance, introduce Beli, son of Managon, a reputed ancestor of several royal families. Beli has no real relationship to chronology in Ash's estimation. He appears as a king of Britain in the 4th century AD, as a brother-in-law of the Virgin Mary, as the grandfather of another hero, Bran, who, it is supposed, must be earlier than that, but his name recalls Geoffrey Belinus, an earlier ruler, and there is solid evidence for a Celtic god called Belenus, who is the common original. However, it should be noted that the Celtic root Bel just means Lord, as with the Hebrew Baal. Therefore, this could easily be a title for a ruler. The relationship to Mary should certainly grab our attention, as should the mention of Bran, whom we may have been repeatedly associated with Joseph of Arimathea. Milner refers to an exhaustive work from 1900 called The Welsh People by Oxford University professor John Rees and David Brynmore Jones, still published. He states, to return now to Bran, the authors of the Welsh people above referred to cite Mabinogion, a collection of old Welsh tales, as calling Bran the son of Lear, and Penedim, daughter of Beli, son of Minigan. Penedim, however, they show to have been Beli's sister and Beli the son of, not Minigan, but the words translated son of Minigan were not to be found in the original of the Mabinogi, having been introduced by a subsequent hand, the actual words having been Beli Mor, Map, On, An, or Onai, which occurs as Beli Mabar Anna in one of the pedigrees in Jesus' College, supposed to be of the 13th century, that is, Beli the Great, son of Anna. Rees and Brynmore Jones translates another Welsh statement from the records as follows, that Anna used to be said by the men of Egypt to be the cousin to the Virgin Mary. This statement, the remark, is also made in the pedigree of Owen, son of Howell the Good, Amalek, who was the son of Beli the Great, and Anna, his Beli's mother, who was said to be cousin of the Virgin Mary, mother of our Lord Jesus Christ. Owen, son of Howell, is a reference to the Welsh king Owen, died 988, son of Hywel. From Owen descended the Tudor kings of England and, by multiple lineages, the present Queen Elizabeth. Patrick Montague Smith, the royal line of succession. This genealogy of Owen up to Anna is incorporated in the Annals Cambrai, the Annals of Cambria, Wales, published by authority of Lord Commissioners H.M. Treasury Longmans under the direction of the Master of the Rolls. In the same place is recorded the pedigree of Owen's mother, Ellen, up to Constantine the Great and his royal British mother, Empress Helena, who, on further research, proves to have been the eighth in descent from Bran the Blessed, son of Lear, and Penardin, sister of Beli, whose mother was Anna, cousin of the Virgin Mary. So Ellen was British. Constantine the Great's mother was British. She was called Helena or Ellen. So, sorting out lineages. Now, how could this Anna have been cousin to Mary? One answer is, if she were the daughter of Joseph of Arimathea, this would have made Beli the grandson of Joseph. The grandson of Joseph is referred to in the other genealogies as Heli. Truly fascinating, considering that the name of Joseph's brother, Mary's father, was Heli. Milner suggests that it may have been a family name. This Beli would have been too late to be the one who fathered Cassivelaunus. In fact, he even seems to be too late to be the uncle of Bran, as Milner and his source suggests. This seems rather difficult to work into the little chronological understanding of the period we have, as it requires Joseph to have been unreasonably old even at the time of Christ's death. Perhaps the truth is that Anna was not the mother, but the wife of Beli. The pedigree of Owen and the above could have been read that way. Amalek, who was the son of Beli the Great, and Anna, that is Amalek's mother, was said to be the cousin of the Virgin Mary. Beli's daughter Penardin may not have been the same one that married Lear, as the name Penardin means head highest, and could have been a generic title for the High Queen. There are many possibilities. Yet, if there is any truth to this, it would seem to require that Joseph's daughter married into British royal family long prior to Christ's death, perhaps closer to the time of Christ's birth, in the early days of Joseph's travels to Britain. It could even be that his daughters being royalty in Britain is what brought Joseph back to Britain, seeking refuge in time of persecution, and perhaps this is what gained him such a favour with the British rulers, as we have seen. We should also consider Joseph's previously mentioned son, also named Joseph or Josephus. He too, if genuinely historical, seems to have been involved in founding dynasties. In any case, it's certainly possible that the Davidic bloodline of Nathan passed into the British royal lineage at this point, especially when we consider that the Romans conducted a purge of David's house late in the 1st century, with no doubt prompted many Davidic descendants to flee to outlying areas of the empire. The Cerdic connection. Around 500 years later, the Angles and Saxons invaded the island and pushed the original Celtic British into its western recesses. People often see no dynastic continuity from the British to the Saxons, but there have been. The question centres on a person named Cerdic. Cerdic, the Saxon chieftain who founded the Kingdom of Wessex, was also the virtual founder of the British monarchy, or at least the English monarchy. Geoffrey Ashe explains, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland grew around England, which grew around Wessex, and the House of Windsor is still descended from the West Saxon kings through all interminglings of Scandinavians, Normans, Welsh, Scots and Germans. Elizabeth II's first Wessex ancestor is Cerdic, who landed on the shores of Southampton's Water with a grown-up son and 5 shiploads of followers. So says the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, put in the event in 495. In other words, the Queen's pedigree goes back to someone whose life overlapped Arthur's. As history, the Chronicle's earliest West Saxon entries carry even less weight than most, and certainly the early line of West Saxon kings is dubious. but the founder, Cerdic, is certainly real because no Saxon court genealogist would have invented him. His name is not Saxon at all, but British, Celtic. It appears in various forms, one of them being Cedric, whence derives cardigan, Ceredig, the name borne by the Clyde rulers, so that it is definitely a royal name amongst 5th century Britons. Cerdic of Wessex may have been Saxon blood, seeing that Saxons accepted him as a leader, but he seems to have reckoned himself a Briton because he gave his son a Celtic name too, Kinric, or Sinric. I think it's probably Kinric. Ash rejects Cerdic's son pedigree, which names his father as Alessa. However, he does offer the possibility of the British-Saxon intermarriage. Perhaps Cerdic, son of British nobility, married the daughter of the Saxon Alessa. Another source states concerning Cerdic's son. Sinric is a hybrid name, half British, half Saxon, suggesting he was of mixed blood. We see the distinguished name affix Sin as Kinglass, or Cuniglassus, whom some have reckoned as Arthur or closely related to Arthur, and Kinfor, or Cunumoris, ruler of southwest Britain at the time. Since Kin is a Welsh version of the Latin Cun, this is further indication that Kinric was a member of the Cuneda family, ruling Wales and southwest Britain during that period, very possibly a relative of Cunmoris. It appears to have been a common practice at the time to seal an alliance between Saxon and Briton families by marriage. Thus, like the various rulers of Wales, the pedigree of the first West Saxon rulers from which all English monarchs have sprung may also go back to Anna, the cousin of Mary, and possibly other members of Christ's immediate family. David's house in Europe. Indeed, there is other means of descent that could perhaps have been made as possible. In fact, that the lineage of Alessa mentioned above is traced back just 8 generations to Woden or Odin, a genealogy often considered legendary but likely true. Though reckoned as god, Odin was evidently an actual person of the 2nd or 3rd century, descended from the Trojan line of Zerah, Judah, and from him descended many of the royal houses of Europe, including all those that have combined to produce the modern British royal family. Milner mentions an ancient manuscript he and others inspected when it lay in the possession of the Herald's College of London, now called the College of Arms. It is called on the back of the binding Pedigree of the Saxon Kings. Milner explains that in this manuscript, Freya, the wife of Odin, figures apparently as the daughter of Cadwaladr, son of early British King Lucius, himself descended from Anna. Should this mean that she, Freya, was daughter of that house, it follows that through their mother, all the lines of Odin come from David. It is a fact recorded by several early church historians that Lucius left his kingly throne in Britain and became the evangelist of Switzerland and Bavaria. Freya might have well been his daughter or granddaughter, settled in Central Europe at the epoch of Odin's historical march into the West. We should also consider the possibility that the line of David became intertwined with the Zerah line at the even earlier point, as ancient Arameans rulers claimed descent from David and Solomon. In any event, it is entirely possible that not only from Zerah, but even from David, have the various royal families of Europe descended. Indeed, it would have seemed to be true anyway due to the intermarriage that we know took place in later ages between the British royal family and the royalty of other European nations. This is quite remarkable. It even seemed to give new insight into God's punishment upon David for his great sin against God, wherein he committed adultery and murder. God told him, "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house." Certainly this was true in David's own lifetime, but it's also been true in the ages since. Europe has been racked by war for centuries, its kings battling against each other for every reason imaginable. And these kings, we now learn, are all of the house of David. What a sad footnote to include in our picture of the glorious legacy of David's throne. It should serve as a warning of the devastating and often long-lasting consequences of sin. Finally, then, we have seen elsewhere how the Davidic line of Solomon of Perez was in the days of Jeremiah fused with the Milesian royal line of Chalcol of Zerah. Now we see the Davidic line of Nathan of Perez was, in the days of Joseph of Arimathea, very possibly fused with the line of the early British kings descended from Brutus, himself of the Trojan royal house of Darda. The Davidic lineage of Nathan was, it seems, doubly fused with the line of Zerah at the time of Odin. Finally, all these strands later became intertwined through a vast sea of intermarriages. Indeed, the lines had fused long before the dominant throne of David lines was transferred from Scotland to Ireland. Thus, it would appear that Queen Elizabeth and her family are many times over the descendants of Solomon and Nathan. But in the end, at the return of Jesus Christ, the Solomonic element in the throne will terminate. Solomon's line will no longer be perpetuated. Rather, Jesus Christ, born of the line of Nathan and not of Solomon, will sit on the throne thereafter, to reign in glory forever and ever. The human corruption and infighting that has plagued David's house will at long last be over, for Jesus Christ will enforce peace throughout all nations. What a wonderful world awaits. So, that was very long, guys. It said at the top of the article it would only be an hour. It looks like it's took probably an hour and a half to read that. Anyway, this is just another connection with Israel, Hebrews, the British royal family, Joseph of Arimathea. And I think there's a connection with Joseph and the Celts. Maybe Joseph was part of these tribes, a Celtic tribe. Anyway, people, I'm going to end the broadcast because that was a long read. And if you managed to stay the whole length of that article, I applaud you, because that was a long one. And I did sort of slip up with a lot of the words, but it's hard to read these really long articles. Anyway, guys, I'll catch you later.